Welcome to Women in the Know, where we discuss everything from politics and policy to relationships and marketing, from franchise growth to difficulty between franchisees and franchisors. Today's topic is grit. We touched on it a little bit on our last show, but we wanted to discuss the specific elements that comprise grit and what it all means in terms of success. So Rebecca, you have a list of markers that tell us all about grit, right?
Yeah, so grit is kind of an elusive thing. We talked about this in the Woman in the Know last week. It's an elusive thing, and it's kind of a word that's being thrown around all the time. But it really encompasses several different, we call them at Zorka profiles, markers, right? Or attributes or characteristics. So one of them that Stan Friedman in one of our earlier shows hit on was grit comes from either purpose or passion, or ideally a combination thereof. So we have greater grit, greater tenacity, greater commitment, greater courage, all of those things when we are doing what we are doing from a place of either passion or purpose, which of course is what this whole show is all about. The second marker is achievement drive. So that's that part of us that actually is driven to climb that mountain, make that kind of money, conquer that challenge, right? It's that drive that is within us. And some of us have it to huge degrees, and others have it to lesser degrees. The third component is optimism. So grit requires optimism. So we're not going to do day in and day out what needs to be done, especially when it's stuff that maybe is hard to do or we don't have fun doing, but we still have the drive. We're not going to do it if we don't somewhat optimistic about the future, that it's going to be successful, that it's going to have an impact. So grit does require a certain degree of I'm optimistic about my future. And then the fourth piece that we're really experiencing a lot of, especially during this COVID, is grit requires adaptability. It's one thing to have grit and commitment and you're focused on your outcomes and you stay kind of on that path. But if you don't have adaptability, the ability to shift when the economy plummets, the ability to shift when there's a new competitor in the marketplace or a new piece of technology. So just being committed is not enough. You also have to have adaptability. And that brings us to our last two. The commitment is the kind of what we all know grit is, right? So commitment, perseverance. It's not deciding I'm going to do this today and this tomorrow kind of thing. It's truly saying, I'm committed to this marriage. I'm committed to this business. I'm going to do whatever is necessary to accomplish the goals and the aspirations I've set for myself. And then the final one is courage, or another way to look at that is initiative. So courage and initiative is the ability to do what needs to be done, even if I'm not confident or even when I lack the competencies. I'm going to do it anyway. I have the courage, not necessarily the competencies, to do what needs to be done. If we take enough initiative, at some point we're going to be successful. So that, in a nutshell, are the markers that are traditionally used when we say somebody has grit.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is when you think of all of those things, they make perfect sense. And you think, well, of course. But then trying to identify which ones are strengths or weaknesses in different people, or what are the common threads. I think Stan talked a lot about the passion and purpose, and you have to find the why in what you're doing, and that without that, the rest of them are harder to push forward. And then when you looked at the issue of the magazine this month, and we did touch on this last week too, with Laura Spalding, Carolyn Thurston, and Lori Spivak, all of them had commitment and achievement and drive. They all, I remember Laura saying, if you have a backup plan, then I'm skeptical that you're the franchisee for me because you've already introduced the idea of failure.
Yeah.
She didn't have a backup plan. Carolyn Thurston didn't have a backup plan. I mean, there were so many times where they just felt they had no choice. And if that's not commitment to something, I don't know what is. I mean, that kind of gets you committed if you don't feel like you have another option.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, some of it's driven by circumstance. Like you really don't have another option right in front of you. But all of them have that passion and purpose first and foremost, I think. So it's fun to look and see how they describe their own ideas of success and how they arrived
Mm-hmm.
there.
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating. And like you said, all three of the ladies and Stan Friedman in our earlier show exhibited this purpose, this passion, the achievement drive, and this commitment. And those three markers are really important. But we can't forget the other markers also, especially when we're going through difficult times. If we're not optimistic, we can lose momentum and drive and enthusiasm, and it's harder and harder to do that. So in many situations, the optimism is just so important. And then the same way, adaptability is also important. I gotta tell you, I've been coaching business owners since 1987, so that's how old I am. And then since 1993, working with franchisors and franchisees. And if you have this commitment and you're, tunnel focused and you're going after something and you're not paying attention to your competitors, right? Next thing you know, the competitor's passing you because you haven't made any kind of changes or you haven't paid attention. You have to have that sensory acuity and that adaptability. So you're nose to the grindstone and you're still going after the target. And next thing you know, somebody's flying by you because you're not paying attention and you're not adaptable and don't have your finger on the pulse of the market, which is why this grit thing is so interesting, because we can possess one piece of it. You and I actually were talking a little bit earlier about ourselves and others we know that have 5 of these things, but we don't have maybe that drive to be a gazillionaire, right?
Absolutely. And what's funny is the more we've talked about this, the more I'm thinking of all my 5 children. Like I can identify who needs to work on what based on these markers. It's so funny because I have one child who's completely literal. So adaptability is a little harder.
Yeah.
I have one, they're all facing optimism issues right now, just because what does their future hold? So I think in business, it works, in relationships, it works, in family dynamics, it works. It's just an interesting way to try to understand someone. And I think as a franchisor, trying to develop new franchisees, being able to recognize these markers and what you're getting and to develop the weaknesses has got to be a critical element of ensuring success.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Elizabeth. It's interesting because we've been watching these markers for a while. And one of the markers we talked about before, courage/initiative, is one we've watched over the last 8 years dramatically drop. And if franchisors and franchisees and business owners like ourselves, if we're not paying attention to why am I not as courageous as I used to be 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years, why am I a little bit more risk averse and more hesitant and, less, not as quick to decision? This initiative part is a challenge. So by knowing ourselves, and Stan Friedman said, know thyself. He talked about that in his segment. Is so important. If we can honestly look in the mirror and say, hey, I got this, but I'm not so much here. What if I developed that muscle of courage? What if I developed bigger ambitions and a bigger dream and tied it to my purpose? Could that cause me to be more successful? Absolutely. Will it also enhance and increase our grittiness? I think is the term that's being used now, our grittiness. And the answer is yeah.
Yeah, well, of course it will. And not only that, you can surround yourself, back to the community, surround yourself with people who fill in your gaps.
Amen.
That I think is also very important.
Fill in
Having
the gaps.
That sounding board, fill in the gaps.
Fill in the gaps, be your inspiration and your optimism when you don't have it, right? shine a light on your weaknesses and your strength. Absolutely. I think the community is so important. When we are going after a goal together, we will do more for others than we'll do for ourselves. It's kind of the law of psychology.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What a fascinating topic, right?
It
But
is.
like always, we are on a time crunch. We'll have to pick up and go more deeply into some of these things another time. So thank you everyone for joining us today for Women in the Know. We'll see you next week.